Hey American literature friends, this is a short video that gets us started on Robert Frost. We're going to dig into him, a little bit of his biography, and then 3 of his poems: Nothing Gold Can Stay, Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, and After Applepicking. You can see Frost here, and he lived a long time. He belongs to the modernist movement, and he is often considered one of the foundational American modernists. Him, Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and William Faulkner. But Frost was older than the rest of them. You see, many of them were born in the 1890s, right around the beginning of the 20th century, or just before the beginning of the 20th century. Frost was born in 1874, and he lived until 1963, so he lived a long life. And he lived through several sort of stages, and he stayed in many ways the same and pretty steady in terms of his work and the tone of his work and his sort of approach to work and to literature. But as the times changed, people he was seen as this sort of important modernist in the 19-teens and 1920s, and then he sort of went out of style in the 1930s as the Depression went, and President Roosevelt and his programs. Frost was opposed to President Roosevelt and his programs, and then he sort of came back into style in the 1950s and 1960s. He was also the first poet who was invited to read at a president's inauguration when President Kennedy invited him to read at his inauguration in 1961. So he started that tradition. Every president since then has done that, and he started that. Frost's poem, "The Gift Outright," was the poem that he read at the president's inauguration. Frost actually, his career started relatively late too. He was born in California, but one of the signal events of his life is that when he was 11 years old, his family moved to New England. And a lot of his writing, just like Faulkner is sort of identified with Mississippi, Frost is identified with New England. And almost all of his poems deal with the New England landscape, places in New England, experiences in New England, you know, snowy woods, picking apples in a New England orchard, those kinds of things. And for the first sort of, after he graduated from high school, the 20 years after he graduated from high school, he did not do a lot of writing. He tried to run a farm in New Hampshire. And then one of the big turning points in his life is in 1912, a few years before the start of World War I. He took his family and left New England and went to England. He and his wife and their 4 kids. This is when he really started working on his poetry, focusing on his poetry. You sometimes get the feeling that getting away from the United States and from New England and getting a little distance from it gave him the perspective he needed to really dig in and start writing about it in the ways that made him famous. His first book, called North of Boston, was published in 1914, right as World War I started. And it was relatively successful. He came back to New England and lived there for the rest of his life. He bought another farm in New Hampshire. Let's see if we can find a picture of it. There's the farm in New Hampshire. It's a historical site now, where when he came back to the United States, he lived there for most of the rest of his life. He did most of his writing that he is famous for there. You see the picture of him for his 85th birthday, and then this is the picture of him in 1910. Just before he moved to England and really got serious about the writing that would make him successful. In the book, if you've got the textbook on the biographical information about Frost, they give you some useful information for understanding Frost. There's a couple of things I want to talk about. The clarity of Frost's diction. He uses clear, simple language very often. The colloquial rhythms, the sort of folksy, it almost feels like you're in the New England countryside when he talks, and the simplicity of his images. He tries to give you crisp, clear images, and that's part of what he's trying to do, is make these sort of startling, memorable images in his poems. In the context of the modernism movement, they can be seen as a thoughtful reply to high modernism's fondness for obscurity and difficulty. A lot of modernism deals with this sort of deep symbolism and exploring complicated layers of the human psychological processes, sort of stream of consciousness and heavy symbolism that you have to sort of dig deep into and make these complicated connections. And Frost is really not trying to do any of that. He's trying to give you clear, vivid images, memorable scenes and memorable people living in those scenes. The other thing that I wanted to call attention to is that, as they tell you in this paragraph at the bottom of the book, there's really several kinds of Frost poems, and as you read them, you can sort of figure out which kind you're reading. As he says, most of his poems fall into a few types: nature lyrics describing or commenting on a scene or an event. Stopping by woods on a snowy evening is probably the most famous of those intense scenes of nature that you get. There are also dramatic narratives in blank verse about country people, like Death of the Hired Man, a poem we're not reading, and where you get these are really his longer, more complicated poems, where he sort of inhabits the voice of some person or character, often this rural person who is having rural experiences. The closest we're going to come to that is after Applepicking, where he gives you the perspective of this character who has picked all the apples in the orchard, who has like worked super hard through apple picking season, has made it through apple picking season, all the apples are picked, and now that person is just exhausted and ready to like hibernate for winter, because apple picking season is in fall. So we'll dig into that. And then the third kind that they talk about, poems of commentary or generalizations. These are his more philosophical or political poems, where he digs a little bit into these sort of more general or deeper themes or ideas. The Gift Outright is one of those, where he sort of meditates on the political and philosophical beginnings of America and how the United States became the United States. So we will dig into, and as I said, he died in 1963, right around the same time that a couple of the other modernists died. Faulkner died in the early 60s, Ernest Hemingway died in the early 60s. You get the sense that by the time you get to the early 60s, modernism was really and truly over, because many of the modernists were passing away, like Frost, and that was the true end of modernism. We're going to dig into 3 of his poems here, and we're going to start with Nothing Gold Can Stay, which is a short, easy poem, but it is one, and it's sort of tricky because you can read it as one of his, oh, this is just a, intense nature scene. This poem is often read as one of his more philosophical poems too, because what he does is connect this moment in nature to this more broader, larger philosophical idea about the cycle of life. Nature's first green is gold, and the green is gold. What he's talking about there is the sort of things blooming, whether it's flowers or plants or fruit or anything like that. The brightest, the golden time, the most intense and valuable, the way that we always think of when we think of plants and flowers and things like that, is that bloom, the first green, her hardest hue to hold. That is also the shortest. It's hardest to get plants to do that and to get plants to bloom very vividly, and it doesn't last very long. Her early leaf's a flower, but only so an hour. So in the life cycle of plants and vegetables and things like that, the bloom, the blossom, is really the shortest part of their life cycle, because there is the sort of growing before the bloom that lasts much longer than the bloom itself, and then the after part, when the flowers die and they sort of die down and then recover to regenerate again, that lasts much longer. In the entire cycle, the bloom is the shortest period. Then leaf subsides to leaf. So as I just said, that after plants bloom, they sort of die down and try to regenerate if they're able to. So Eden sank to grief. This is where he makes this much deeper connection, where in Christian mythology, in the history of the world, the Garden of Eden, and Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, is the bloom, it's the blossom, it's the best, the most intense experience. It's also, in the sort of grand scheme of human experience on earth, in Christian mythology and Christian iconography, it's the shortest period. The earth existed for a long time after God made it, and then the Garden of Eden is just there for a little while, and then most of human history is this post Garden of Eden period. So Eden is the bloom, and it's the best, but it's also the shortest period. So dawn goes down to day. So dawn is the prettiest time of day. It's also, it doesn't last very long, 10 or 15 minutes, and then you just have the rest of the day. Not as vivid, not as pretty as dawn, but it's the majority of the day because nothing gold can stay. The best, the brightest, you only get a little bit of it, it doesn't last long. So you have this nature imagery, but then Frost takes it and turns it into this more philosophical pondering. A sort of more simple but intense nature imagery, and maybe Frost, like I said, maybe Frost's most intense nature imagery is stopping by woods on a snowy evening, which is just, it's a poem dedicated to, and we've all had those moments. You see some very intense, very beautiful, very striking scene in nature. A sunrise, a sunset, you know, rain falling super hard, or a super bright sunrise or something, or a super pretty sunset or something like that. In this case, you have this guy who is riding home and he sees this really pretty scene of snow falling in the woods, and so he stops and looks at it. He's riding home. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. So he's going down the road. He sees these woods. You know, it's some neighbor of his who lives in town, so that guy's not going to mind him stopping and looking. So he stops and looks and just watches the snow fall on the woods. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near. Again, this is an older poem. This person is like in a horse-drawn wagon or something like that, and the horse is like, hey, we're not in town, we're not home. Why are we stopping, you know, by the side of the road to look at these woods? My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. So the suggestion is it's sometime in early winter, probably December, something like that. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. So the horse is like, hey, you know, why are we stopping? It's cold and dark, we need to go. The only other sound's the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. So it is this very quiet, very peaceful scene. You can hear the wind blowing the snow around. You can hear the snow falling on the trees and the ground. But it's this very quiet, very peaceful scene, which is part of the intensity of it for the narrator, part of the beauty of it. The woods are lovely, dark and deep. So again, part of the scene is it's just these deep woods and then snow falling on them. And it's so dark. It's this dark night of the year. But I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. So you have this moment where the narrator has this intense appreciation of this beautiful, intense scene, and he pauses, he stops the horse, he stops the carriage, he stops and looks at it, and just sort of has a quiet moment where he just appreciates this beautiful scene of snow falling on the woods. But then he's got stuff he's got to do. The horse is right. They need to get going. And he's got stuff he's got to do and places he's got to go. So he has this moment of sort of appreciating this scene of beauty, and then he's like, all right, time to move on, time to go. The third one that we're going to talk about here is After Apple Picking. This is one of Frost's more famous poems, in part because it is this very intense, it is read as a very intense New England poem. You know, we have apple orchards in Georgia, like in the North Georgia mountains, but apple picking and apple cider and that kind of thing, it's really popular and really common, and many of our apples come from apple orchards in New England. And traditionally, New England is big into like apple cider, fall apple festivals and things like that. It's a big part of New England culture. And so this poem, which is about the end of apple picking season, all the apples have been picked off all the trees. These guys have been working every day for months to get every apple they can and to get everything they can out of the apple harvest. And now it's finally done, and this guy's just exhausted. He's like, I was super excited for apple picking season, and now I'm just sick of it and ready to collapse and hibernate for the winter. My long two-pointed ladder sticking through a tree toward heaven still. So if you know anything about picking apples, you put a ladder up into the tree, get up in the tree and start picking, and put them in your apple basket or apple barrel. And this guy is so tired at the end of the day that he didn't even bother to get his ladder down. He just left it up in the tree and was like, I'm done, I'm so exhausted. And there's a barrel that I didn't fill beside it. So again, like, he didn't even finish filling his barrel. He just left the barrel out by the tree. He's like, I'm done, I'm so tired. And there may be 2 or 3 apples I didn't pick upon some bough. So he's like, I might have even missed an apple or 2 or 3, but who cares, I'm done. But I am done with apple picking now. Essence of winter sleep is on the night. This is that kind of sleep, and y'all may have experienced this sleep. Often the best sleep you have is that winter sleep where it's nice and cool and you're really tired from doing some kind of physical work, and you just like fall into bed and you're immediately asleep, and it's almost like you're having a mini hibernation. The scent of apples, I am drowsing off. I cannot rub the strangeness from my sight I got from looking through a pane of glass I skimmed this morning. So he thinks back to when he got up this morning. You know, it's frosty, it was really cold. He looked out as the last morning he was going to pick apples. He looks out through the window and held against a world of hoary grass. Hoary grass is like that winter grass when the grass is sort of white and covered in frost. It's almost crunchy when you walk out and step on it. It melted, and I let it fall and break, but I was well upon my way to sleep before it fell. And I could tell what form my dreaming was about to take. And he knows he's been so into the apples and picking the apples, he's even dreaming of apples. Magnified apples appear and disappear, stem end and blossom end, and every fleck of russet showing clear. So he's just dreaming of apples and every part of them, the top and the stem, the bottom, just like he's done so much apple picking that it's even infected his dreams. My Instep Arch not only keeps the ache, it keeps the pressure of a ladder round. This is a line that students often don't understand, but if you've ever climbed a ladder to do any kind of work and like stood on a ladder for a long time, maybe to paint something or to pick apples or to clean a gutter or something like that, you'll know what he's talking about. You can feel the groove of the ladder in the middle, the arch of your foot, if you stand there long enough, and especially if you're balancing or putting pressure on your foot. And he's been up there on the ladder picking apples for so long that even when he lays down in bed, he can like feel where the ladder was in the instep, in the arch of his foot. I feel the ladder sway as the boughs bend, and I keep hearing from the cellar bin the rumbling sound of load on load of apples coming in. So they would take the apples, they would get the harvest of apples, the baskets and baskets of apples, take them down into the cellar. Many places in New England have cider presses where you will take the apples that aren't perfect. They might have some little bruise or imperfection. Those apples they wouldn't take and sell them. They would press them and make apple. That's the apples that get used for apple cider. For I have had too much of apple picking. I am overtired of the great harvest myself desired. Again, this like at the beginning of the season, you're like, yes, it's apple season again, I'm ready. By the time you get to the end of apple season, you're like, dear God, I'm done with this. I'm so tired of all these apples. There were 10,000 fruit to touch, cherish in hand, lift down, not let fall. For all that struck the earth, no matter if not bruised or spiked with stubble, went surely to the cider apple heap as of no worth. There you go. The apples that they picked and that were perfect, you know, they kept them or took them to the market or something like that. The ones that fell or got bruised or something like that, they got pressed into apple cider. One can see what will trouble this sleep of mine, whatever sleep it is, whether it lasts a few hours or whether he hibernates all winter because he's so tired. Were he not gone, the woodchuck could say whether it's like his long sleep, as I describe its coming on, or just some human sleep. And so woodchucks, like bears and other animals, hibernate for all or most of the winter. And so he's saying like he wished that he could talk to a woodchuck and compare his sleep to the woodchuck's hibernation and see how close, because he's so tired, see how close his tiredness and his sleep is or feels like to like animal hibernation, or if it's just a normal human sleep. because he feels so exhausted and so tired from this like season of working day after day after day to get the apple harvest done. And because he's overtired, as he says, he wonders how his sleep compares to that like winter animal hibernation, or if it's just some human sleep, you know. So this is one of those where he inhabits the voice of some character in New England, in this case, an apple picker, and thinks about how that person feels at the end of the season. So you have, we really ended up with one of each of the three kinds that I talked about. Nothing Gold Can Stay gives you that sort of deeper philosophical thinking about the brightest part, the most intense part of life is the shortest. Stopping by Woods on Snowy Evening gives you one of those sort of intense nature scenes. And then After Apple Picking gives you one of those voice of some character in New England doing some New Englandy activity. If you jump over here and look at the Frost response topic, select one Frost poem, Mending Wall, Nothing Gold Can Stay, Stopping by Woods on Snowy Evening, and explicate the images on which the poem is built. What this is really asking you is to take apart the poem and look at all the images it is built on. In this case, like hibernating like a woodchuck, and feeling the ladder in his foot, and all of the different intense images that he builds each poem out of, or like the jingle of the horse jingling its bell and the snow falling in the woods. That is to say, how does Frost use specific concrete images, these very specific like things you can touch and feel are what he builds his poems on, and sensory details, things you can smell, things you can taste, to build a scene and meaning. How does the poem become more than just the sum of its images? So once you've sort of toured through or talked through all of the images, how does he assemble all those images to make them not just a pile of images, but to turn them into this larger, complete poem, where he has assembled all these images or sensory experiences, but once he's got them assembled, it's almost like a car. A car is not just a pile of parts, it's something beyond just the parts that make it up. How does he take all these parts and assemble them into a complete poem that sort of works and flows, is what this topic is asking you to do and think about. If you have questions about any of these three poems or about this response topic, as always, please feel free to be in touch with me. If you want to dig deeper into Frost, Frost is one of those writers who on the surface seems simple, because so often his poems are made out of these sort of clear, vivid images, but there's more layers and depth to him, especially if you dig into the longer poems, like Death of the Hired Man or something like that is one of his bigger, longer, more complicated poems. If you've got questions about any of that, or I can tell you more or help you understand better anything related to Frost, just let me know. And otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this dive into his poetry. Thanks, everybody.